Hello and welcome to the Alive, Digital Humans and Their Organizations podcast. This series explores themes and topics relating to all things digital and the shift we're experiencing as the digital era impacts our lives everywhere. My name is Georg Seiler. I'm from the Ludic Group, and this episode is brought to you by the authors of the book Alive, Digital Humans and Their Organizations, published by Navarro and available on Amazon, Kindle, and in bookstores near you. This episode is about how to use digital to create meaningful alternatives and shift mindsets. We are joined today by the authors Paul Ashcroft.
Hello.
And Garrick Jones, dialing in from Tokyo.
Hello.
With our special guest, Paul Miller. Paul's a writer, storyteller, and executive coach working with many of the world's leading organizations.
Hi, George.
So why don't we start with an extract from the book, Alive, Digital Humans and Their Organizations.
Thanks, George. Paul, in the book we wrote, to transform our societies, cultures, and organizations, we need to create meaningful alternatives for ourselves as digital humans. This will require a vision inspiring enough to make individuals truly want to see it realized, and motivating enough for them want to be part of building it. What do you think?
Well, what jumps out at me straight away there is that although we're talking about a digital future, these are the rules of transformation anyway. If you look at the language, in order to transform meaningful alternatives, not just any alternatives, but alternatives which have meaning within them, vision, inspire, motivate. This is all the language of change. So that's the first thing. Yes, so I think it goes to the very heart of the matter, which is that how are you going to get people to venture into a new world, especially if it seems scary, especially if change is happening incredibly fast. So I think that we need to do what we've always done, which is create meaningful stories, compelling visions of the future that people want to step into. And I'm reminded, because I'm a storyteller, of course, this plays to my strength, I'm reminded of Jonathan Haidt's description of the brain, where you have the neocortex, the rational side, which is very much the rider of an elephant. But then you have the limbic system, although this is very simplified neuroscience. You have the limbic system, which is essentially more of an animal part of ourselves, which is to do with trust and safety. And so in a sense, the narrative that we come up with can't just be a logical and rational one. It has to be one that's emotionally engaging, because otherwise it doesn't create meaning. That's the point. It might make sense, but we need to create meaning. And of course, once we're motivated, then we will move in that direction, however hard it is. So the thing that's just jumped into my mind is Napoleon, who'd said that the morale of his army was absolutely critical to his success, and that he would take that above, another 10,000 men. And I think there's something in that, in the sense that if you want to do anything that is, not start a war, obviously, but if you want to do anything that is extraordinary or is extremely challenging, then the success is largely determined by the degree of conviction and meaning and purpose that people see in it. So in the digital world, whilst we're afraid of it in many ways, then in many ways we're burying our head in the sand, and we take the power away from ourselves.
So, Paul, there are two things that's fascinating, your response. The two things that really jump out at me. One is this question about the fear of digital, but the second one is about what digital can do for leaders as they need to motivate and inspire their people. You talk about. Let's deal with the first one. I mean, what do you think digital provides that hasn't been provided before, that enables digital leaders? And what do you think it is that digital provides that enables leaders to inspire their troops in a way that hasn't been able to be done before?
I think it's reach. It's the number of people that you can reach in a very, very short space of time, be that just a podcast or a webinar, but more likely a whole program which you can effectively do with people all the way around the world in 3 months, which would otherwise take you 3 years, and which would probably have stumbled over those 3 years anyway. So I think that you can reach a lot of people, but I think one of the principles to be mindful of is care. Because now that you have such reach and such speed, if you get things wrong, they're magnified. So there is something to do with, I think in digital generally, is to do with accepting that it's not face-to-face, it's not business as usual. So therefore there are new rules and new standards by which to do stuff. I'm thinking here, Garrick, my mind's gone on a tangent, but I'm thinking of trying to get stuff out on the web, and you might get no hits, but you can also get 11 million or 100 million hits on something if it goes viral. And I don't believe that is just, advertising and marketing tricks. There's something in that. I think that a message can still be heard, and when it is heard, great, because you've got enormous reach.
And what about the fear? You talked about the fear of digital and leadership. What would you have to say about that?
Well, I'd say that there's always fear when it comes to change. And I think fear is always the enemy. And it's always the enemy, no matter what it is, and whatever the change is. So, again, I've thought of something slightly tangential, which is of Stephen Covey's famous book, The 7 Habits. It begins with be proactive. And the whole reason that is that we don't want to be dependent or be a victim. We want to be on our front foot. We want to control our own destiny. So I think fear is a disenabler, because we tend to step back and we become more reactive and more defensive, when actually, in fact, we should actually embrace it and look at it and get the right people on board. We will make mistakes, and they will make mistakes, but that's fine, because I think iterations are faster in the digital world. We can kind of go again often.
Paul, do you think it's easier or harder today with digital? For thousands of years, people have created meaningful alternatives in many ways, creating visual spectacles that bring people along with them to their vision of the future. With digital, is that easier? Is that harder today?
Well, that's good, because I believe it's both easier and harder. And I'll tell you why it's easier, or why it's better, if you like. Let's look at it that way. It's sort of better and worse, I would put it. So in the past, if you have the power, if you like, if you are the church or you are the state or you have the printing press, you can influence people for generations and generations and generations. They don't necessarily have access to information outside the worldview that you've given them. So, if you're brought up in the Catholic world, the world is Catholic. Whereas now it's not like that, because we can get access to different mindsets, worldviews, at any time, all the time. So it becomes much harder, I would suggest, for like a totalitarian regime, which runs on a mindset, an ideology, a story. It becomes much harder to achieve that, because the narrative can always be disproved or interrupted. So to the harder bit, well, it's the flip side, which is now you're putting a message out there. Well, we're quite used to messages. We're getting them all the time. We're bombarded with them. So people, one, are much more sophisticated, so they can see through something that's phony. Two, they've only got so much bandwidth, and just grabbing attention isn't enough. So I come back to the other point, it's harder, and so therefore the antidote is, in a sense, the care that's put into it, the attention, not just to detail, but to authenticity. And actually, it's a two-way street, so it's dialogue. So we're not just pumping stuff out there. It's actually, you can pick up digitally what people want, because they're recording it all the time for you. You can have 3,000 people on on an app where we're voting in real time, and we can look at that kind of information.
Well, as you know, I'm fascinated by what leaders can do with digital, and I'm fascinated by the way things are working out in the world today. I want to explore a little bit further with you the ideas that all a leader needs to do is motivate and to bring people together in the digital world, even though it's more difficult because there is so much feedback and there is so much face-to-face. It's difficult because there is so much feedback, and it enables leaders to have sort of one-to-one relationships with people because of digital. But we see in the world today the whole question of fake news. We see the question of leaders calling people to action around ideologies that might be detrimental to society. We're seeing large kind of groups of people getting together. I don't want to get too political about this, because I think the same things can happen in organizations. That these are the things that I'm afraid of, because, as you know, I'm very pro-digital. I think it can be used as a massive force for good, and I think that there are huge opportunities to get people engaged and get their involved and get their points of view and be part of the narrative. But I think there is a danger for misuse at the moment, because not everybody is able to play on a level playing field. What do you think about bad leaders, for example, people who use it for purposes that maybe aren't in the common good?
Well, I think they're no different to the leaders in the past who did the same thing. They just perhaps have a much more powerful medium, which we haven't quite yet learnt to use as well as we should. So, for example, I was just, as you were speaking, I know from my history that when the Romans left England in the second century AD, the people in generations after thought that giants had lived on the earth, because their buildings were so huge. They were living in mud huts, and here they were, buildings 3 stories high, made of stone. So if you think about it, that's kind of like fake news. And if you look at rumour, for example, I turn around and will say to you, look, do you know that so-and-so has done such and such? That's a story I'm telling you. And if you believe that story, okay, so there becomes a kind of truth about it. So if you like, what's happening digitally with fake news is the problem we have as human beings all the time, about establishing what is true and what isn't true. Now, I know you're talking about facts, and there is such a thing as fake news. People are telling lies. But I think that business has a tremendous opportunity in all of this, because if we do have authentic leaders, if we do have value-driven businesses, they're so powerful. There's so many people within a business. They have so much power in society that actually they can set the tone if they choose to.
And Paul, who should own that vision, that articulation of that vision? Is it the leaders, or is it that everyone within the organization has a story to tell within that as well?
I think it's the latter. I think it's the people within the organisation. Else, in many senses, it's meaningless. It's the leader sets out the vision because it makes it possible. Steve Jobs made it possible, but he doesn't own all of that, does he? He doesn't own what has happened. It wasn't as if he sat down and did a map and said the world will look like this. I think he articulated something, but it's other people, the people within the organisation, the lifeblood, who live it out. And then if we see it lived out, so do other people copy. Well, we say copy, but they model. That's the experience that's around us. People become like the people they are around. So within businesses, and with 185,000 people globally, you've got an enormous opportunity to do either good or bad, which is the start of the question. And I think when it goes bad, it's terrible. And that's possibly one of the fears for the digital, is that, you can very quickly harness millions and millions of people, and you can restrict them via feeds what they're actually got access to. That's one of the issues.
We talk about in our book, the need to co-create alternatives and how digital allows us to co-create new worlds. The question of whether those worlds are good or bad is, I think, a different, probably an ethical, even philosophical debate that we need to have, and maybe we will have some of that here. But certainly in one of the podcasts we'll get into it. But the possibility of co-creating alternatives on a very large scale with lots of people using digital, being involved in the narrative, actively involved in the conversation, creating memorable experiences digitally, and using the digital realm to enable people to have memorable experiences together, and to recognize and reinforce very actively the new world that emerges or that is being transformed. Again, these are the things we know about powerful leadership and what they achieve. But what is it about digital? Are there principles about the digital realm that leaders can take and perhaps shift their behaviors in order to enable and make the most out of what digital offers?
One thing I heard you say, Paul, was that broadcast isn't enough. With digital, it's got to be a two-way process of dialogue as people are constructing that new reality together. I think, as I heard you say, a leader who is just looking to use this shiny new tool or set of tools to tell their story is going to be lost.
Yeah, beware. I would say that this thing of co-authorship and doing stuff together, it falls neatly into this idea of engagement. Everyone wants to engage people, and in business it seems to be, like a magic word or a difficult word, but how do we engage people? Well, actually it's quite simple. There's the staircase of engagement where you can pump information out, you can be autocratic about it, you can tell people what to do, or you can start to involve them. So digital automatically has the capacity to do that. So automatically it's very democratic, so it's very involving, and by the time people are starting to come up with ideas, create solutions for their own issues and challenges, well, I think you already move further up the engagement staircase. And I think the mistake is the shiny new toy thing. And in terms of Garrick's question around, advice to leaders, is that it's the human element that drives the technology. So, the idea, Heidegger, the philosopher, said that nothing wrong with technology, but the tail is wagging the dog. And the other thing that comes to mind is, a brilliant servant and a terrible master. So the advice is, what is it you're trying to achieve? Well, you're trying to inspire people, motivate people, organize people in a meaningful way. Well, it has to be authentic and from the heart. I don't just mean it has to be soft and fluffy. I mean that you have to think that we're doing the same thing in terms of motivating people, but in a different universe.
One of the things that we know is that people will only step into a new future if it's firstly easy to do so, but secondly is significantly better than what they currently have. It is painful to change and do something different. And so it needs to be demonstrably better than what people currently are experiencing. Paul, as a coach, if you're working one-on-one with somebody, you might ask them the question, do you really want it? Do you really want to change? Do you want to be fitter? Do you want to be faster? Do you want to have learned that new instrument? Yes, of course I do, but perhaps have you thought through, do you really want to? Are you prepared to put in the things it's going to take to achieve that and give up the things that are not required?
No, that's a really good point, because in coaching, as a coach, you're looking for the difference that makes the difference. It's not just anything. It's actually listening to people in such a way that you can ask the questions which direct them towards what they really want. So, for instance, someone can have an enormously well thought out plan for their fitness, and yet that they've been urged by somebody else and the motivation isn't there. So we come back to what I talked about earlier on about the limbic brain. That's the elephant. And if the elephant doesn't want to do it, it's not going to happen. And in coaching, we're always looking for kind of accelerated learning, always lifting up resources, always finding the point which has the highest leverage. And I would suggest that's also true when we're coming back to leaders in the digital age, is that in many ways it asks us to be more mature human beings. It asks us to be more advanced, if you like. It sets us a challenge. Our communication has to be at a higher level. I know you know an awful lot about this stuff around nudges. You know more than I do. But there's something about being able to influence people, and especially not directly, that it's just proven in psychology that people will want to adopt it. Well, those are just in coaching, in business executive coaching, and in sports coaching. They're just basic rules, really, and we need to become more sophisticated. I think we are actually in the language that we use and the beliefs that we propagate and the stories that we tell.
So, Paul, you talked about creating these meaningful alternatives and engaging people at scale. What are some of the things that you've seen work?
Well, we talked about creating meaningful alternatives as a two-way process. As a leader in an organisation, no longer is it satisfactory just to have a great idea and use digital tools to broadcast. We need to find a way to bring everybody along with us on the journey. And there are many ways to do this. So, for example, what we've seen work is where you use, for example, a visual artist to come in and work with teams to help them tell visual stories about what the future is going to look like. So you're constructing that reality. But with digital, you can now do this in a way, of course, when many, many thousands of people can become involved and add their ideas to form new ideas that become part of that future. That would be, for me, the first step. After that, it's about making it real and bringing the future more into focus by making it more and more clear and more tangible and more relevant to the people that we're asking to step into it.
Well, that's fascinating, because as a writer, that's exactly what you're trying to do. You're trying to create a world in 3 dimensions that people can explore, literally. So when you're watching a film, we partake in it. And I think lots of the things from the arts have found their way to business, obviously, but even more so now, the kind of films that can be made on a handheld camera, the way that people can feed back, making their own films. And I think the other thing is this notion of the tribe, because what you want to do is bring people together in a virtual space, as we've done in the past, and you find that all of a sudden they're starting their own discussions, they're posting their own resources. So now they've picked it up and it's kind of organic. Now you're talking, now it's becoming real, because we really aren't broadcasting, because we're not even supplying the content. They are.
And then you talk about this element of being 3-dimensional. So what are some of the ways that digital can enable that 3-dimensional view?
So we've seen organisations use tools such as virtual reality to really bring to life in an immersive way what the future is going to look like, whether that's a new way of working, a new process, a new technology that somebody has to adopt, even bringing to life for customers a service that is being created in such a way that the customers can interact with that service before it's being built to get feedback so that it can be designed better and more powerful in reality.
So bringing it to life so you can see yourself in that world.
You can physically see yourself, you can participate already in the new reality in a meaningful way before it even exists. Now, this is by far faster, better, cheaper than what's been possible in decades.
And what I find fascinating, again, coming from the arts, is you look at people with gaming, right? They just expect that. There's a whole generation that have grown up with these extraordinarily powerful experiences, which, sometimes they become addicted to it. It's so powerful.
And there's an expectation. Because they are addicted to it and because they're immersed in these sorts of worlds, there's an expectation that the way the stories are presented to them, they are immersive, they are dynamic, they are fast-moving, they are visual, visceral.
Yeah.
And if when I come to work, my experience of this is the opposite, it's black and white, it's monotone, it's banal, why would I step into that future? I'm far more interested in what's going on outside of work than inside of work.
And I think this comes to another important thing about digital, which is that the lines between what we would have called, work and play, or work life and personal life, it's a much more kind of porous membrane now. So we realise I think business actually has always been slow to recognise that some of the things we do in life which engage us and motivate us and the experiences we have, to import them in. And I know 25 years ago, coming from the world of arts, we had a great time because there's certain principles of engagement and ways to put on events, the way to run conferences, the way to coach speakers, etc. We're having this enormous effect on people. But now, I think it's gone way beyond that, is that people have the expectation you spoke of. And games aren't just games. You know, games are ways that you learn. Games are ways which you...
was part of the brand experience, isn't it? So you're creating a reality that your brand is part of establishing. And so there are lots of different aspects that you do to make that happen. In your experience, Paul, what have been some of the mistakes or issues that you've seen where leaders are trying to do this in a digital organization but are not succeeding?
I think the classic mistake is to think that the old ways work in the new world. So we've mentioned it several times, just broadcasting. I think e-learning is another classic mistake. It's an old world kind of point of view, 20th century point of view, that you kind of go, hey, okay, we just take our learning online. You go, no, it's a much, much bigger immersive thing than that.
One of the things I would add to this is personality. So organisations still, although may be becoming software organisations, are still not machines. We're still human-based businesses, corporations, organisations, and the leader or leaders of those organisations are personalities, and it's still their personalities that purvey and shape the nature and the purpose of that organisation. Now, what digital helps that, or those leaders do, is really make that personality expand out into the organisation in a really powerful way. We talked earlier about how it can be used for less positive purposes.
That precisely because you have to now be able to sit comfortably in front of a camera or talk to people in the moment in a way you never had to before, because you've got kids who are 10 who can go out on the web. Everyone can start their own, their vlogging or their own website. And so people are brilliant in front of cameras, and they expect the same of you. So you're actually quite vulnerable as a leader, as an answer to your question, if you're not actually very savvy in terms of media.
So linked to digital as a leader, there's also this element of enabling access to you as well. So anyone can pick up a camera phone and make a video and say whatever they want and post it on their enterprise social network for everyone to see. So how, as a leader, do you thrive in an organization like that where you can no longer restrict the content or the message? You have to allow it to proliferate.
So in a world where we are faced with 1 million messages a minute, the louder and clearer specific content can be, the more powerful it is. So as a leader, the challenge is to get one's arms around the message and get one's arms around the future in such a way that you can allow everybody to contribute, but still shape it towards a coherency and a future destination you're actually looking to work towards. Otherwise you have chaos, of course. And I think one of the ways to do this is to be prepared, as Paul said, to be vulnerable, to incorporate the feedback as you get it.
And I think, coming back to vulnerabilities of leaders, is if we think that the way that we present ourselves via the media, all these different types of media, is very much in the old style, shirt and tie, and very much sitting down for an interview, it kind of somehow, it's a bit like the horse and cart versus the motor car. It reeks of an older time. And I think there's something about being more casual, because people don't need to be really slick anymore, which is interesting, as you can be a very, very powerful leader without having to be slick.
They need to be conversational. They need to be leaders who can have a conversation with their organisation at a personal one-to-one level, but do that with thousands of people at the same time. We have digital technology that allows us to do this, enables us to do this. figuring out how to use it is the challenge. And I would go back to what we talked about earlier in terms of the shiny new tools. We currently are still living in a world where we don't really know how to use the tools we've got. Paul, I know one of the things you talk about is, do we have software that we're still figuring out how to use or how to make the best of?
I think that the thing about virtual reality or the virtual world, digital, is that it's not precisely the normal world. And so people say, well, it's not as good as face-to-face, or it's not this, it's not that. You go, no, it's not. So therefore, why don't we articulate the rules and think harder about how we use it? I mean, this is only a small thing, but I know by doing virtual classrooms and doing virtual coaching that there's certain things that you do differently, right? There is more of a setup time because of the fact that technology is more vulnerable. It won't be at some point, but it is. There is a whole thing around how do you manage something when people are falling off the call? What are the rules you need to set up so that they're not working on the side, going off to make a cup of coffee? And actually, they're really straightforward rules. And once you do them, the level of engagement goes up. Then you get massive engagement. And yet people turn and say, oh, it's not as good as face-to-face. No, I didn't get as much from it. Well, that's not true of some of the programs that I've been involved in, because people really are, and the figures show it. They're there from the moment we start to the moment we finish. But we're doing, I mean, I'm not going to go for all the stuff we're doing, but basically we're in the engagement game, which brings us all the way back to storytelling and show, and the arts, if you like. But it's unthinkable that you would talk to people who are not available to you. So therefore, how do you make it possible virtually so that they are? So you prep them before the call. You create contract with them when they come on the call about stuff. You continually ask them to keep their videos on. You refer to everyone to keep them in the game. You control the numbers of people on the call so that they can't disappear. And you're always experimenting for that kind of optimum. You put responsibility on them to contribute rather than being taught. So it's not a teaching thing, it's facilitation. So we come together to practice and share experience. Therefore. And all these things we can know through digital who's an expert in what and where and how, really very simply. So that's an example of where the software does one thing and yet we don't know how to use it properly.
Well, we need new rules. New rules for new tools.
Everyone, thank you so much for a fantastic conversation. I'd just like to hear from everyone around the room your closing thoughts on the topic. So, Garrick, let's start with you.
I think for leadership, the idea of meaningful alternatives is something that has always been around when it comes to motivating, and as Paul Miller was talking about, inspiring others and inspiring large groups to kind of embrace a different world and a future world. The thing about digital for me is that the digital realm enables us to make that future world much more tactile, and we can feel it and we can understand what the implications are in a way that we've never been able to before, whether those are scenarios or simulations or some of the other things we talked about. And it's up to the leaders to really embrace everything that digital has, not only to get people engaged in the conversation, but also to put forward a much more powerful sense of what that alternative is and to make it more tactile using all the tools we have, whether there's a 3D or virtual or scenarios or films or multimedia, and then get people talking about those conversations.
And Paul Miller?
Which is that everything is so different, and we've got a kind of tsunami of change, but change is change. And it's the same old pattern that we'll always go through when we come to change. So we shouldn't be afraid of it. We should embrace it. And then the other point, which I think is really important, which Paul Ashcroft mentioned, which is new rules. It's not reality. It's virtual reality. It's digital reality. So therefore, we need to learn new ways of thinking about it, new rules for interacting, new protocols. And lastly, We need to know that it's a solution. It's not just technology driven. It's solutions that we're looking for.
Paul, Ashcroft?
So we've been talking about creating meaningful alternatives and quite deliberately chosen the words meaningful alternatives. So the alternative future that a leader is looking to create should be meaningfully better or easier than the current reality. And not just for everyone at the individual level. And one of the main things I think digital presents as an opportunity for all of us is to personalize and make meaning for everyone in the organization, or at least make it possible for them to create meaning themselves in a vision that's presented to them, and do it in such a way that it's visceral and emotionally engaging and visual and stimulating and experimental. Because in that way, it becomes more real as people are able to put their own thoughts and their own ideas in it. It then has meaning for them.
Thank you, Paul Miller. Thank you, Paul Ashcroft and Garrick Jones. You've been listening to a Ludic podcast, Alive, Digital Humans and Their Organizations. Thank you for joining us. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast series, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts and having you join us next time. Goodbye.